Personal freedom, political liberty, and free speech, defended by force of arms if necessary. Welcome to the Resistance Library from ammo.com, where we believe that arming our fellow Americans both physically and philosophically helps them fulfill our founding fathers' intent with the Second Amendment to serve as a check on state power. Thanks for tuning in to the Resistance Library podcast. I'm your host, Sam Jacobs, and I'm here today with Andy Marcantel. He is an attorney out of Arizona, specializing in Second Amendment topics, and we are just thrilled to have him on today because I know that a bunch of you probably wish that you could just talk to, a lawyer for 5 minutes before they, before you need to, basically. You work with Attorneys for Freedom, and in my research pre-show, did I see correctly that you consider yourself an anarchist?
Well, hey, Sam, happy Thursday. And your research on me is, well, you know what? The term anarchist, I like the term because it's a provocative term and it gets the type of reaction that you just had. There's certain imagery that comes to mind when you think about anarchy. But really, at its core, anarchy just means a system with no governmental coercion, a system where one is not compelled, or said another way, the system of government or lack thereof, there's not constant violations of non-aggression principles. People are not coerced into involuntary action, both in their person and in their business. So insofar as that's what is meant by anarchist, yes, that's how I would identify. Some would call it a libertarian. Some would call it a voluntarist. I like to simplify it and just say, I'm a live and let live kind of guy. That is definitely a way that I would like to identify myself.
So how does a lawyer become an anarchist or an anarchist become a lawyer?
Well, it's really driven by a dissatisfaction with the current system. It's really driven by, we can do better than this. What is the role of government and what should the role of government be? If you think, for example, that the role of government is to be the paternal parent and treat us all like a bunch of babies and control every aspect of our life and tell us what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we're allowed to use our time and property, well, then you disagree with my position. You would perhaps be a socialist or something that advocates for a larger government. However, if your conclusion is, the only role of government, insofar as it should exist, should be one to prevent somebody from trespassing against another person. And if the government isn't intervening with the sole purpose of preventing a trespass of one person against another, for example, if they're intervening for a moral reason, right, because they know how we should live our lives or what we should put in our bodies or how we should use our own time and property, then they are violating, in my opinion, that important ethical principle.
So on the topic of the government intervening in people's lives, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about, given that you're an attorney, I want to talk about the McCloskeys, first of all. And for those who don't know, or for those who need a reminder, because there will probably be some turnaround time on this, the McCloskeys were the couple in St. Louis who had a protest go through their gated community, their private gated community. They smashed the gate and stormed on through. And the McCloskeys came out, they say, in any event, in response to threats with their firearms, and were prepared to defend their, I don't even want to call it a house because it's this like ancient, it's this like 100-year-old mansion that was designed for the founder of the Bush beer, dynasty, I believe. I could be getting some details on that off, but I'm less interested in your philosophical stand on it than I am in what you would say, and you can give the disclaimer too, but I'll give the disclaimer as well that like none of this is legal advice, guys. So if you need legal advice, go get a lawyer and pay them, preferably somebody at Andy's firm. But with that kind of caveat in front, What is the lay of the land with regard to use of force, self-defense in that kind of a situation, which I think is, going to be increasingly common in this country, at least up until the election?
Sure. So I think these are all great questions, and just on a point that you just pointed out about me giving legal advice. Let me just give a little bit of background about where I'm coming from and what I'm allowed to talk about whenever I'm analyzing a specific set of circumstances. I'm licensed, and the other attorneys at my firm are licensed in Arizona and Hawaii. Those are where our two offices are. We've got an office in Chandler, Arizona, and in Honolulu, Hawaii. But we also practice in federal court, and we practice in federal court. I'm licensed in the Ninth Circuit, but I do travel all over the country to handle different firearms cases. I was just, for example, on Tuesday, I was just in Las Vegas handling an extremely high-profile ammunition sales case over there. Now, when I give advice to people, because as you can imagine, as you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, you probably have a lot of listeners that wish they could just sit down with an attorney and ask them a litany of questions of, is conduct A justified under the law? Is conduct B justified under the law? Well, none of them are easy questions, because when we're dealing with a legal analysis of a given circumstance, we're looking at it through the lens of multiple layers of law. We've got the state law. Each state has their own specific laws, some more friendly to gun ownership and use, some less friendly. And then you slap on top of that a layer of federal law, of federal mandates and regulations. So whenever I give analysis of a crime, keep in mind, giant disclaimer, even if I give you a broad federal analysis of a given incident or circumstance, there could be specific state laws that also cast a different light on it. So all of that giant disclaimer now being stated, let me first start, and I've seen the video. I don't think I've seen it in its entirety, of the couple that were, they claim to have been defending their property and everything like that. I don't know. I need some more information. For example, I've heard varying reports on the extent to which this crowd of protesters entered the neighborhood. For example, some sources have said this was a straight up break-in to private residential areas. They basically broke down a gate and were trespassing in this private community. That obviously casts an extremely different light than if they were let in or walked into a publicly accessible area, and certainly would go to the reasonableness of the actions of this particular couple. I'll say this real quick before I go any further on this subject, and I think any competent gun owner can agree. The video tends to show that these two people, regardless of whether they were legally justified in their actions, they probably need a little bit more training with the firearms that they had. The way they were holding them, pointing them all over the place, and fingers on the trigger, and some things that might reflect less than fully responsible gun use, even if legally justified. So I'm sure every competent gun owner watched the video, even if they're in agreement with this couple, and cringed just a little bit at how the firearms were handled. So that's just a minor point. But whenever I'm analyzing whether somebody's acts were justified, you're really asking me, hey, Andy, do you think that a randomly assembled jury in this particular jurisdiction will come to a consensus that the actions of these people were reasonable? That's really what you're asking me, because for the most part, all gun laws, when analyzing whether or not this conduct was a crime, are trying to get at a question of, were the firearms reasonably handled? Were the firearms reasonably displayed such that it was necessary to repel a significant amount of force? People are different and have different positions on these things. I can tell you from somebody who's done many jury selections in firearms crimes and vetting out the juries, we do something at the beginning called a voir dire, which is basically where we select the jury by asking them questions and use those questions to ferret out some people who we don't think would be good jurors. We get a certain amount of preliminary strikes, and the state gets a certain amount of preliminary strikes. Well, I got to tell you, having done these in gun cases before, I lose just a little bit of faith in humanity every time I do one of these things. I'll ask questions like, who believes that no private citizen should own guns? And inevitably, I'll get the hands that'll raise up and say, you know what, I think only police officers should be able to own guns. And you can guess what I do with that person. I give them a strike and get them the hell out of the jury room. You never know. I say this to illustrate the point that you never know who your jury is going to be and what type of mentality they're going to be comprised of. So when you ask me a question like, Andy, this couple and this mob that came in, having, even in the worst case scenario, breaking through a gate and coming onto private residential property, do you think that they committed a crime, or was their conduct not criminal? All you're really asking me is, Andy, I want you to predict for me what a randomly assembled jury from that community will come to a consensus on. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to do that, but I can tell you my own personal opinions on it. But once again, I need a little bit more facts. But in my opinion, as long as they defensively displayed, and these, their reports are that the mob was basically yelling at them and making active threats that were planning on coming onto your property and destroying your property. It's my position, and I would strongly advocate for, if I was defending them, that they are entitled to a defensive display of their firearms in order to repel an imminent and real trespass that could happen.
Yeah, and I think that that's a fair, I don't, for anybody listening who thinks that that's a dodge or lawyer talk or something, that's not any of that. It's real talk, because anytime you do this, anytime you would find yourself in a situation like the McCloskeys, there's what the law says, what statute says, what case law says, what a prosecutor will argue in court, and what a jury of your peers will ultimately decide. And as you say, what is the lay of the land here is in a sense a question of asking you to predict something that is well outside of your ability to predict. And so I think it's a very fair and honest answer. I also think that you're doing God's work in the Ninth Circuit, because regular listeners of the podcast know that I'm not a fan of the Ninth Circuit and its decisions, generally speaking, and many of them are also not. So this kind of gets to a broader question that I had, and that is, there's an old saying, it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Is that still true? In a environment where there is, at the very least, on the part of a handful of zealous prosecutors, an extremely hostile view toward the Second Amendment, and certainly at the level of certain appellate courts in the United States, one of which would the Ninth would jump out as a great example of that. And even sort of what we're seeing at the Supreme Court, despite the fact that it has quote unquote conservative justices on it, we're not seeing a Supreme Court that is terribly, warm to the Second Amendment rights that people have enjoyed in this country previously, to say nothing of the kind of the private sector harassment and this kind of like these self-appointed freelance Stasi agents that run around the country, filming people and exposing them and doxing them and contacting their employer and their landlord and things like that. So I just threw a lot at you, but kind of to get to the core of it, is it still better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6? And if so, why?
Right. A lot of great concerns there. And just to kind of put a bow on the last point, in terms of analyzing every case individually in terms of reasonableness and what a jury will think on that, there isn't a law out there. There's not a statute out there for every given situation, right? There's not a statute out there that says when an angry mob of protesters breaks into private property and walk by your house making active threats to enter and destroy your property, you're allowed to do X. there is, as you can imagine, the law would be extremely voluminous if we attempted to make a law for every situation. That's why every single one of these cases ultimately falls down to what the 12 people in the jury box find to be reasonable. So that being said, just to answer your question, does it make sense? And does the jury system of 12 people in the box, is that the best way to achieve justice? This is more of a philosophical question, right? Because objectively, just practically speaking, the answer depends upon the jurisdiction that you're in, right? There are certain jurisdictions where you're more likely to get a decent, reasonable panel of 12, and certain jurisdictions where you're likely to get an unreasonable panel of 12 who may just automatically be hostile to your issue. Maybe it's not even specifically guns, but there are certain parts of the country that we tend to see more demographics of a certain either political leaning or social leaning or anything like that. So is it the fairest way to do it? Probably not. There are many, for example, who have advocated for positions of professional jurors. In other words, not people randomly chosen from the populace, but people who we as a community put in place because we have a certain amount of faith or demonstration on their part, by free market determined factors, that tends to show that they're able to actually follow the law rather than just go with whatever their emotions or political leanings may incline them to do. I kind of like that idea. I'm partial to the idea of professional jurors, and this would ensure that the people who are sitting in judgment would be well educated on the issues. They'll have demonstrated to us that they're capable of following the law. And some also, as should be with anybody in a position of power, some mechanism so that if they abuse that discretion or demonstrate us that they are incapable of following the law, we can easily and swiftly remove them from that position.
Sure, and as somebody who's served on a jury, I'm very sympathetic to the George Carlin quip that if you think about how stupid the average person is, and then half the people alive are stupider than that. Right. That was pretty much my. I served on a jury once, and that was pretty much my experience. People were much more concerned with. And I am not exaggerating one iota. People were much more concerned with getting home in time to watch the game than they were with, making sure that justice was served, and there's a man's life in the balance here. But I'm also sympathetic to the William F. Buckley quote, and I'm by no means a big fan of William F. Buckley, but one quote that always bangs around in my head is that we're better off being ruled by the first 500 names you can pick out of the Boston phone book than by the staff of Harvard or whatever the exact quote is. I also think that there's a danger where the judiciary in this country is just so increasingly politicized that it would be difficult for me to see how you would keep something like that from being extremely politicized. But I'd love to hear your response to that, because I'm sure it will be intelligent and thoughtful.
Well, when you're dealing with a jury, just as a practical matter, I can tell you this. The ones that always end up in the jury box are the ones that we as attorneys generally know the least about after that voir dire questioning process, right? Because the ones that speak up loudly towards either position, either, yes, I'm inclined to find the defendant guilty just because of my own personal opinions, or, you know what, everybody should be able to own a gun and there should be no restrictions. I'm a hardcore Second Amendment guy. Both of those people end up getting stricken before we get to, assigning the final jury. So the ones that typically we end up with, we know the least about. They maybe kept their mouths closed. They didn't gripe over having to be there. They just kind of sat there quietly. And so it's most of the time a total crapshoot, what we end up with in terms of the jury. But as far as the, as you mentioned correctly, the judiciary is becoming more and more politicized. You had mentioned earlier the supposed conservative Supreme Court and everything like that. I don't want to associate any court, any appellate court or Supreme Court or court of final jurisdiction. I don't want to have to associate any one of those courts with being left or right or liberal or conservative. I wish that our society was such that we wouldn't have to make that kind of an analysis, right? Because if you're saying my court is conservative or my court is liberal or left leaning or right leaning, then that is a factor that is going into their ultimate decision making that has nothing to do with the truth and has nothing to do with analysis of the law and has nothing to do with justice. And it basically, in my opinion, politics should be purged from the equation entirely. Now, I know practically speaking, that's going to be difficult to do in the current two-party system. And this is why I think now is a great time to think beyond the rigid two-party system. If there was ever a time in this country's history where a different way of casting these issues or a third party more bent on promoting freedom and pushing the bus forward towards in the right direction towards freedom, if there was ever a time for such a party or school of thought to emerge, now would be the time.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. Because I think that I don't want to idealize it too much, and I think that there's an easy way to do that. But I do think that it's to me it just seems patently clear by the way that our Supreme Court nominations are held today that in generations past what we looked for was more kind of even-handed people who knew the law very well. These were the types of people that we looked for judges. Yeah, sure. That used to be it. I mean, that was pretty much it. And now it's just this kind of, anytime there's a Supreme Court nomination, which a lot of men who aren't into sports, my bad habit is watching the news and following politics. But anytime there's a Supreme Court nomination, it's very, very little about the actual qualifications and training of the nominees to the court, and much more about kind of checking off this, checking these boxes on this strange kind of inquisition into what the ideology of the jurist in question is. And I agree with you that there's something that's kind of gone amiss with our court system when that's the case. And I would say that that's even true, when people that I like get on the court. Like Clarence Thomas would probably be my perfect jurist on the Supreme Court, but even he came out of this. I mean, his was maybe the first after Bork, I guess. But there's this highly politicized process now that completely lends itself to finding these politicized nominees, or just people who've managed to fly under the radar enough that there's nothing kind of like at all interesting about them whatsoever, so we can just throw them through and they'll make it through the process just fine. I mean, one of the, it's not like I have much in common with Pete Buttigieg, but one of the things that he said during the debates that I thought was really spot on was about how kind of unhealthy it is for our political climate to have this apocalyptic, attitude about all of our Supreme Court nominees. And every time somebody dies or somebody retires, that we kind of have to get into this last battle for the freedom of the republic, war with each party kind of digging its heels in. I think that's a gross oversimplification of it, but I think that it's more true than not. So how do you think that we would kind of back away from that? What would you propose as a kind of solution, or at least a way to de-escalate that?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it all comes from and you kind of alluded to it, the crazy hyperbole that either side will say whenever, oh my gosh, there's a conservative judge is going to be appointed. That means that all women's rights on abortion are going to be set back 80 years. And oh my God, there's a liberal judge that just got nominated. Therefore, drug crimes are going to run rampant in the streets and criminals will be being released from prison and pardoned left and right. There's just constant hyperbole nowadays because of the deep polarization between the parties that's going on in the country right now. And it needs to stop. It needs to come down a couple of notches in terms of the tension. What the best way to do that is there's reasonable minds can differ on that, but it seems right now that both parties are just kind of ramping up and doubling down, almost trying to outdo each other with the sensationalism of how they report and speculate as to the success of the other party and the ramifications thereof. So I think it all just kind of comes down to we need as a country to bring it down a few degrees and take a deep breath and realize that we're all on the same team here. This isn't a constant competition. The inclination when a left-leaning judge leaves the court and now there's a position open, the inclination shouldn't be, well, let's put somebody on our team who can stack the court and make it so that we have a plurality. The inclination should be, let's put on somebody who has a respectable career of following the law and knowing the law and being a good jurist and getting the law right that we all decided should be the law. So I think it's just a matter of removing the political influence from the judiciary.
But here's my question about that is how many of these jurists are there around anymore? These kind of, I don't want to say apolitical, but non-politicized, let's say, jurists who are sort of more known for their fairness than being, a good soldier for the other team. I mean, have we kind of passed the point of no return on that?
Absolutely not. They are still out there. I just got off the phone with one. We had a big lawsuit in Hawaii where we recently sued the governor for violating and overstepping his legal bounds for their quarantine order over there. And we worked with a retired judge from one of the circuits who was an appointee but has no allegiance whatsoever to either the political parties and is a brilliant jurist. He's exactly the type of person that I would pick, and there are many other judges. I won't mention his name here just because he was a consultant with us, but suffice it to say, there are many judges out there in the world who are excellent jurists who are beholden to the law, or who are at least striving to be beholden to the law, rather than any one political party. Now, we only hear about the ones who are, the reason why you asked that question perhaps is because those aren't the types of jurists that the media is interested in talking about, or that the political parties are interested in talking about. And that is exactly the problem, is that there's these brilliant jurists out there, non-beholden to either side, who would be perfect for the type of job that we're talking about, right? Even-handed interpretation of the law. But because they're not a sexy topic, that's not a sexy topic right now. The good topic is, who can we appoint from our team who will make our team be able to get what we want? And that is the incorrect analysis, in my opinion.
Last question that you may not be able to answer in the way that I'm hoping, but this was suggested by a friend of mine, and he wanted to know under what circumstances a person might be able to defend their dog with deadly force, of course, referring to the tendency of dogs to get shot when the police show up at your house. Is there kind of a rubric anywhere of the degree to which you're allowed to defend your dog's life?
Yes, and I love the question. I love it whenever animals come into the equation, because animals are one of those weird areas where in certain circumstances we could just completely relegate them to the status of property, like we would. The equivalent would be, well, Andy, am I allowed to use deadly physical force when defending my couch against somebody who wants to do harm to it? But in other areas, we give them what I would call pseudo-human rights, where we say, well, hold on, you can't just treat an animal like you would a couch and leave it in your backyard and not care for it or anything like that. So whenever animals come into the equation, it's an interesting circumstance. So once again, and you may not like this answer, but it's the truthful, honest one, it depends on the situation. I can imagine certain circumstances where if the police are threatening my animal, or if the police or an intruder are threatening my animal or something like that, such that it's in my immediate vicinity and the bullets are going to start flying, I could justify my defense of, basically trying to stop the officer or intruder from, and sometimes those are one and the same, from randomly firing their firearm in a small space, or in my house, or in my living room, or something like that, and justify that of trying to protect the rest of my family or myself. Now, generally speaking, there's a flatline rule that says you absolutely may never use deadly physical force to defend mere property. mere property alone will never justify the discharge of a firearm. That's kind of the commonly accepted rule. That being the case, if they're going to start shooting firearms or start using deadly physical force themselves, you do not have to wait until you've actually been shot or there's bullets ricocheting around in the area in order to return fire and defend yourself. So it would be a circumstance basis, but I can certainly imagine a circumstance where it would be justified to use deadly physical force if somebody is planning on also discharging deadly physical force, whether aimed at a dog or a wall or a piece of property or whatever.
Andy Marcantel of Attorneys for Freedom, where can people find you online, if anywhere?
Well, we are super easy to get a hold of. If you just search for Attorneys for Freedom, you will find us. Our website is attorneysforfreedom.com. We are active in Arizona and Hawaii and beyond. We have cases all over the United States. We're a hardcore pro-freedom firm. We advocate for any issue that can promote freedom. We have high-profile litigation challenging multiple of the governor's orders right now. Yesterday, we had a big story in the news where a woman was charged with violating the Arizona governor's stay-at-home order, and that case was completely dismissed. And so you can find out about, we have a lot of, we're a civil rights department too. We have a lot of cases where we like to go out after bad cops, and we like to support good cops. And so you can learn a lot about our law firm just by searching Attorneys for Freedom. Our website is attorneysforfreedom.com. You can always email me at Andy, ANDY, at attorneysforfreedom.com.
And if you have any money left after you pay their retainer, you should go to ammo.com/podcast, where you can get $20 off any order of $200 of ammunition or more. Once again, I am Sam Jacobs, and this is the Resistance Library Podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.